Okay, Steve, I think we can get started, and anyone else who joins, they'll join afterwards, but I think we can get started. So
All
over
right.
to you.
I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. And well, thank you, IT Cloud, for this opportunity. Again, questions come up, by all means, it's okay. Feel free to stop me. Today, we're going to be going through backup and disaster recovery. I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of some slides. I'm just going to, we have an hour. So I wanted to make sure I get through certain slides to really focus in versus others. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So really, what is the need for backup and data protection, right? And what I'm really going to be doing is also, because all of you are in Canada, I'm going to talk about some various Canadian compliance and regulations related to backup and DR to actually help you sell as well. Now, I'm going to be going through some qualifying techniques, sales tactics that I've learned over the years, some objection handling you're going to have both on the backup and the disaster recovery side to help you. How are you going to upsell and cross-sell as well? DR is not for everything. There are some things you could do in the backup product depending on the need, which I'll go through. And then where does DR play with everything? Then I'll try to go through a couple of go-to-market strategies for you to help you think a little bit more how to segment your database properly. And then, like I said, how does this all fit in with Canadian specific items? So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right. As you can see, yes, this is a little bit of an eye chart, but you have to understand one of the things as far as the service provider goes, right? You certainly want multi-tenant, multi-architecture, right? And how many platforms, how many integrations? Actually, we have over 300 integrations now with the product. And a lot of different languages. We've been around for a very, very long time, right? There are some free items that are actually in the product that you can make sticky for your clients as well. And like I said, I'll be going through some of these things here, but just know that one of the things I always tell people is, you know, data protection and cyber protection kind of go hand in hand, right? I mean, backups by themselves is pretty much dead, for lack of a better term. And what I mean by that is if you get compromised because you don't have good cybersecurity practices, your backups are going to get compromised, right? And vice versa. It's like you have all the security in the world, but if something goes wrong and you don't have backups, well, you know, that becomes a problem also. I guess I should introduce myself before getting started. Again, I'm Steve Brining. I've been with Acronis for 8 years and about 2 weeks now. And I've been in the cybersecurity space for 30 years, mostly on the manufacturing side for software, a lot of different types of technologies. CISSP, Masters in Cybersecurity, but also I am also a commanding officer in the Arizona Army National Guard here down in Arizona. I'm actually retiring next July after my 20 years of service, and look forward to finishing up that part of my life as well. So that definitely keeps things interesting. So you'll see that we have a lot more stuff, but one thing you're going to hear ad nauseum from Acronis is one agent, one console, all right? And there are some benefits to that, which I'll go over in a little bit. From a deployment method, most of the time people are doing the Acronis hosted, which means that the management server is managed up in our cloud storage. It's the easiest one to install by far. Also understand that, you know, every client that you have in Canada, when you set this up, it's going to know you're in Canada, and all the data, all the management server, everything stays in Canada for you. Okay. Yes, you can do a hybrid situation. You can do service provider hosted, but I can tell you it gets quite expensive to start doing those things. And that, but I could tell you that a majority, like 98, 99%, are all doing their Acronis hosted. So it's interesting. Our backup product used to have, Sorry, something just popped up on the screen there. All right. I'm trying to see if I can get this off the screen. There we go. All right. So again, backups by themselves, if you don't have phishing, ransomware, all that stuff to protect it, you really start to get into danger. I noticed that there was something in the chat. Sorry. Oh, if you have any questions, yep. Yeah, Celine, just let me know if a question pops up in it. Again, one thing is that it can be white labeled, even down to the install of the agent. And you can customize email settings, your logos, the web color schemes, and things like that. But one of the things I really liked is that the agent itself, when it's actually being installed, you can customize that as well. We do have in a lot of different languages. Yes, French is one of them as well in the product. And depending on the user, they switch their language. Like I said, we have a lot of integrations out there with a lot of different things. And we kind of went over this, but one of the things is that we have a flexible model of a per gigabyte or per workload licensing model. There is a pricing calculator out there that IT Cloud, it's actually in the partner portal that you can get to see which way, depending on how you operate with that client, to see what makes more sense. Maybe not necessarily Canada specific, because this was NIST, but a lot of companies worldwide do follow this type of thing. And what you see there is the 6 pillars of the Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 that came out February 26th last year, 24th, 26th. And really what it did was on the far left there, you see govern. But it really did, if you have companies that are following this as a standard framework, the one on the left there pretty much made the executives be a little bit more accountable to things. And all this slide is basically saying is with the Acronis solution across the board, we fit into all 6 pillars. From a backup perspective, we've been doing that since 2003, backup. So we do a lot of things in it. One thing about our cybersecurity, one of the, how do I say this? If you're running other antivirus and malware, EDR, so forth like that, right? We've been in this space for about 5 years. Actually, our ransomware has been in our backup product since 2017. But people say, well, you haven't really been doing it that long, but who really cares what happened 20 years ago, right? I worked at McAfee in 1995. Who cares how we did it back then, right? All this does is just say that we have third-party certifications that basically say, yes, we could do the same thing of all the big boys do. Virus total, AV test, VB100, and so forth. And the HIPAA compliant thing, that is actually, yes, that's US, but that's for disaster recovery. Also SOC 2 Type 2 compliancy, which we'll get into. All right, now we can really start getting into the meat of things here. When you have new prospects, I have another question that I usually ask. And one of them is, what security risks concern you the most? I didn't say cybersecurity risks. I just said, what security risks concern you the most? Because you might be pleasantly surprised. And I asked that question a lot over the course of the last 7+ years. You'd be surprised at the answers you get. It could be from, ransomware. We've been hit before. Another company owner I know got hit by it. Phishing, insider threat, stealing stuff. We live in a flood zone, and 2 blocks away, they got flooded out. You don't know what the answer is, but then that helps you start to tailor the question, right? I personally never ask a new prospect, what products are you using? I stay away from that, but I usually say, so what does your, for lack of a better term, stack look like that helps you manage it? So how do you manage the backup, DR, and cybersecurity overall, right? You might be pleasantly surprised that they may be running 5 different or 6 different tools just to do that, okay? Um, have you faced ransomware, malware, data breaches? I'll be honest, sometimes they won't tell you, right? Just like surveys and reports out there. If you see a number, expect it to be higher than the percentage you see in these reports, because some people don't want to put the bad names, for themselves out there. But it's a new prospect, and sometimes they'll give you those answers for it. When it says, have you faced data loss due to failed backups or slow recovery, I would just say, tell me, when you've lost a data or when you've gone down, how do you define downtime, right? And what did that look like for you? And might pleasantly surprised with that. One of the things that a lot of people don't do in backups is they don't validate the backup before bringing it back, because that takes more time. They're just assuming it was there, and everything's good, right? With the managing the backups in different environments, again, things get complex. I mean, yeah, if you have smaller clients, yeah, sure, it might be all just cloud, or hey, we have all virtualization. But as you get into different companies, when you start having cloud stuff, some stuff on prem and virtual, that takes on a whole different dynamic, right? And then you got different network segmentations, right? And how do you manage the backups across those? What if you had to switch over from a virtual to a physical server, right? For example, I wouldn't necessarily ask the question about how much time does IT spend managing backups. Um, it's just it's to me that, again, I'm a cybersecurity evangelist at the company. Um, that question, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to help you. But one of the things that I tell people is, in the event if you had an outage, how much data could you afford to lose? Think about Amazon, right? Imagine they were down for a minute, and they're, people buying stuff. Can you imagine that, right? But that becomes an expensive proposition, right? Because they probably have like an active situation, right? If one goes down, it automatically switches over. This has nothing to do with the Amazon Web Services fiasco that they had. I'm just talking about their e-commerce portal. Uh, I'm going to get into the compliance things, and I wouldn't ask this question, but when you see the slides later, what you're going to get, that's going to really help you really steer this more toward Canada. Some of these objections, I don't know. I don't think people just copy from Windows Explorer anymore. I think people do have some kind of backup. A lot of people sometimes think the cloud vendor will back it up for me. How do you know? Did you ever try to recover from that? What is the data retention policy? Because you're going to have different things for data retention policies across the board. Okay. Um, Cloud vendors, if they do provide it, there are a lot of them out there that do just have some basic backup, right? Do they have the ability to do immutable? Do they actually scan the backups for malware? Probably not. We can if it's in an Acronis data center. But some companies, the data retention policy might be longer than others. I would also have a conversation with your clients about data minimization techniques, meaning you can hold on to things for 18 years, but boy, if some lawyer comes walking in or some process server comes walking in and the company gets served and now you're on a legal hold, you can't exactly go in and start deleting 12 years worth of backups, right? And they could probably be using that stuff against the company. So you really need to talk about developing policies with them. What is the retention policies? When it comes from a compliancy or regulatory standpoint, you can't go below it, of course, but do they want to go above that? And do the policies say for executives it's going to be this type of retention policy versus sales versus marketing, right? And if all this stuff's written way before a legal thing happens, it really works to your advantage. I know about free utilities, and let's just face it, you get stuff that's freeware, right? It's a lost leader to try to get the other stuff. For example, like even in our product, right, with our vulnerability assessment scanner, the free one, yeah, it helps you with the Microsoft stuff. But if you want to do the Windows third party, type stuff, yeah, that's going to be in one of our one of our packs, right? So got to be careful of that. Also, support for those things. Um, if you're using a free utility, a lot of times, you just got chat and email and get spawned within 24 hours if you're lucky sometimes. But they do provide limited capabilities. Um, Workstation backup. A lot of people do backup servers, right? Of course. But when it comes to workstation backups, you have to think about the executives in particular, for example, or directors, right? Um, you may not be backing up, let's just say, the front desk receptionist one, but do you have something to eventually go back to, right? So in other words, a lot of people sometimes make like what they call a gold disk, like on the third of the month, right? And in the event something happens, well, it's easier for us to just, refresh it with that gold disk image. But they lose a lot of data if they're not storing it somewhere else. One of the things that you should be aware of is something called the 3-2-1 strategy. And what that means is you have three sets of data. That means including your active one that you're working on. You want to back up to two different mediums, and one of those have to be offsite. Those two different mediums could be external hard drive, cloud, tape, I don't know, whatever. Um, and then one offsite, right? So that could be tape. It could be that you take the external hard drive home or it's stored up in the cloud, right? So that's that 3-2-1 strategy. And again, if the laptops themselves have a lot of business critical data on it during the day and before it actually can back up, right, that might be a challenge. That's where continuous data protection comes into play, like Word documents that the lawyers are working on. If they're making changes to it and the last backup was midnight last night and they can't restore their computer, what about all that time during the day? Well, that's where continuous data protection can come into play. Uh, my systems never crash. I wouldn't say I don't expect they will, but people say, well, our hard drives, we do things, a good way. Um, the question comes down to is it's an insurance policy. And I could tell you that if anybody ever said to me my systems never crashed, I'd be like, okay, tell me what would happen if it did. What would that look like for you, right? And let them talk. Um, I could tell you that when I was in grad school, my backup thing got screwed up, and then the whole thing went down. I had to mount the drive. It was a Linux system. I had to reinstall everything, um, and that took me days to do that just for one server. And what was the impact on my productivity with that? Right now, for a company, how much revenue? One of the things about a Acronis instant restore, what that means, um, and you have to have a virtualized environment for this, okay? And the agent has to be installed on, say, the Hyper-V or the ESXi host, okay? Um, it will spin up a new virtual machine for you. It usually takes about 1 to 2 minutes. I know it says here within seconds, so 60 to 120. But typically it is about 1 to 2 minutes. And you point it to a backup that you already have. It will then, after spinning up the machine, point to that backup and start bringing data over. And then when they need it, it brings it over. You can create that as a temporary, or you can actually finalize it. They could be working with it. And when you got everything repaired on the other side, you could then bring that back. I call this more of a disaster recovery light situation. This would be really great if some executive loses their laptop and they got to work online with an instant restore. That would be a great example as of it. I don't care about that. All right. When you look at our again and universal restore that you see there, universal restore would be if I have a Dell and a Lenovo laptop, and I need to take the backup from my Dell, bring it over to a Lenovo. Now, if that Lenovo had specific funky drivers, I can, during the process of restoring that backup, install those drivers. Where you typically get into that is like RAID, fiber type stuff. Usually you get some funky drivers there, but you can have it point to a thing, actually have it part of the install process for Universal Restore. Um, well, it's called Acronis XDR now. That incorporates the EDR product. The advanced backup that you see there starting next month no longer exists. So all the features that are going to be in the advanced backup, they call it, are going to be part of the core product. Part of that is if you're dealing with people that have clusters, um, if they're doing Oracle, SAP HANA, that continuous data protection thing I talked about. And the example there I'll use is a lawyer, like I said, 7 in the morning, they get up, having their coffee, 3 hours, they're working on track changes on Word documents and they're saving it to their laptop. And then all of a sudden it crashes and burns. Okay. What are you going to do? They have to go back to midnight last night and they lost all 3 hours. But if they were working on those Word documents, that could have been stored to the cloud, the latest version of it. And then they could have restored to midnight last night and get all of those files that were in continuous data protection. I can tell you continuous data protection is not, all right. If you try to talk about that, I would not, it does not work for table level writing stuff, one-to-one, many-to-many, one-to-many, all that stuff. So QuickBooks, MySQL, SQL, all that stuff. It's more for things like PDFs, images, Excel, Word, things like that. So we have a big breadth of things there. So one of the things with a new prospect, okay, is you really have to let them know that because what companies are really looking for service providers these days is they don't want to have multiple providers providing different things for them. Let's face it. So you have to put yourself out there as a full service provider. Right now, if you've been a break fix type company before, but you're getting into this, okay, cool. But if all you've done is just backup, I could tell you that eventually some other service provider is going to come along and say, we do both backup and cybersecurity, right? We can provide a whole stack on the cybersecurity side along with backup and disaster recovery. And if all you're doing is backup, people want vendor consolidation like that, because when there's an issue, it's not only just dealing with the support from the manufacturer, but then different service providers. I've seen where people had two different service providers, or they're using you as a service provider for backup, but internally they're doing cybersecurity. And if that's the situation, you can turn around and say, okay, so when downtime happens and you get hit with things, how are we going to work with you and how much longer you think that's going to take, right? It's all about a time thing at that point. When it comes to the go-to-market strategies, I would definitely switch to verticals, because your email messagings or your messagings out to people could be very tailored, right? You have different buzzwords in different industries. I'm in the National Guard, right? For me, you're going to talk about FIPS 140-2. You're going to talk about FIPS and compliancy. You're going to say, a whole bunch of things, right? In HIPAA, there's going to, like for the US with healthcare, it's going to be a different, vernacular. Finance, different vernacular. Company size, that all depends. I've dealt with clients as small as 3 computers, right, all the way up to NASA with 95,000. Okay, big difference, right? And different ways of talking about things. Um, when you talk about titles of people, like for example, I'm a commanding officer, right? I have, you know, colonels above me, and then I have a team of 33 people, right? I'm not going to be the ultimate decision maker, but I do have signing authority for a certain dollar amount, right? And am I going to be influential? Because I could tell you some of the people that are in my unit are going to be more influential to the process than I am, right? So never take that for granted that just because of a title that a person may not be your best friend. to do things, because some of these people have expertise and I got to rely on those expertise and their feedback for things. Bundling things, right? Create bundles. It makes it easier. The more simplified you can make it for your customer to understand, the easier it's going to be for you to sell. I'm doing things locally with network associations and lunch and learns here in Arizona, for example, just as more thought leadership in the state of Arizona. And you can see, like, if you're ever on my LinkedIn, you can see that I post things. If you've ever heard of CompTIA, they spun off GTIA. I'm part of their ISAO Advisory Council. I'm actually the only manufacturer that's on that because they know I could be very vendor neutral. And I just did a thing about compliancy is a risk to service providers if they don't do it the right way. It was a 5-minute video. So it's a lot more things like that. Also, lost leaders can't hurt. One of the things I always tell people, we're talking about backup here. You could have been talking about cybersecurity. You could be talking about email security, all right? Disaster recovery, data loss prevention, all that stuff, right? You got a whole bunch of stuff that you sell. The reason why you ask questions up front, all right, is just to find out what basically is the issue, okay? When I worked at a company one time, we had over, and this is a Fortune 100 company, we had a lot of active products. And I literally walked into a large company and I said to them, I said, we could do a whole bunch of things, but you don't care. I have to ask you a whole bunch of questions in order to make sure, A, are we a fit? And two, which solutions could even remotely even help you? That's landing. All right. You may be starting off with backup. You may be having to do cybersecurity and they don't even want to talk to you about backup at this point. Land on something, adopt it, make sure it works. Then you have the right to expand upon that and then ask more tougher questions with them. Again, the more that you can upsell, obviously you get reduced churn. Again, do you ever do quarterly reviews with your customers? And be honest, right? How are we doing? How could we improve? In the military, we have something called the AAR, right? After action reviews. And that is something that you got to be very vulnerable. Like, you got to be open to it, to listening to them on that piece. Let's see. I think I'm going to go into vertical markets. Again, if you're going to do some more things with verticals, definitely understand the regulations and compliances. Understand what's going on. Yes, these do take time. And once you're in a vertical, really start asking for referrals. All right, let's get into some Canadian specific stuff. Uh-oh, what happened to my computer here? Okay, there we go. All right, so you all understand probably the first one there, right? The Personal Protection and Electronic Docs Act, right? It's more from a federal side up in Canada. For your backup and DR requirements, right? You keep personal data only as long as needed. How do you define that? I have absolutely no idea. But you want to protect against loss and theft, and that includes backups. So backups is definitely something that is kind of a requirement under this. From a 365, right? Obviously, the native retention on there, right? It's 30 days. I mean, by default 14, but most admins send it to 30. You could pay more for that. That's supposed to be no immutable, not mo immutable. Or point in time recovery, really granular recovery in my term. And there's no long-term audit ready backups on there. So when you do 365 backup with us, if you're paying per seat, you do get the unlimited, hosted storage with us, right? You can keep it as long as you want. Again, we also have email archiving, which can offload some things, right, and put it into more of a cold storage. But you want to practice also how long you keep that data, like I said earlier. And what are the fines? Yes, it says up to, but you have some mandatory breach reporting there, right? So you have reputational damage, right? Specifically in Ontario, the health privacy policy, right? Immutable backups is written in there. You got to have DR testing with defined recovery time objectives, right? So your RTOs have to be defined. How long is it going to take you to do that? For health records, you got to have full audit trails, right? 365, do they really have an air gapping or built-in immutability for it? As a matter of fact, if you look at Microsoft Services Agreement, section 6B, I'm going to translate it, but you can look it up. It says, while we strive to blah, 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 basically don't rely on us, we highly recommend you use a third-party backup solution. Microsoft even has it in their services agreement, okay? Again, really what these two boil down to is the risks, reputational damage, as well as possibly losing contracts with healthcare. Then obviously you have OSFI B13 on the financial side. Your RTOs have to be less than 2 hours. That's supposed to be a recovery point objective, a near zero recovery point objective. Geo-redundancy backups outside of your primary site, and you got to have at least annual DR testing and documentation. For example, 365, can you do customizable RTOs and RPOs, right? And is there any kind of guaranteed geo failover for user data? Okay. CASL, that's a spam law. When it comes to preserving proof of consent, right? So when you have backups, let's just say of emails, you want to make sure that you can prove that, hey, they did in fact consent to this. The consent records in 365 are deleted after 30 days, right? And there's no long-term searchable archive. Get audited and see what happens there, right? Again, M365 protects the platform, okay? Not your data from deletion, corruption, or compliance gaps, okay? Basically, the law is placing backup and DR burden on you with that. Law 25, sure you're all familiar with this one, all right? Where are we? There it is. Oh, this thing got in the way. Mandatory privacy impact assessments, right? It's pretty much, in my opinion, Canada's toughest privacy law. If your 365 backups are outside of Canada, you are 100% not in compliance with that. FIPA, that is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. It applies to public sector and contractors there. All the personal data accessed only in Canada, right? Unless you have ministerial approval for that. Again, everything's got to be 100% Canadian hosted. Again, in Alberta, right? Ontario, okay. Yeah, Alberta, right? There's, you can see their FIPA. It's very similar to PIPEDA. Again, reasonable security safeguards, including backups, right? They expect proof. Can you show immutable encrypted backups during an audit? Again, Ontario, I want to make sure. Again, if you're dealing with health stuff, it must be encrypted plus immutable. All right, for FIPA. The others, it's got to be stored in Canada. And you got a mandatory DR testing, both on health and public agencies. Okay. If you backups are not FIP ready, you risk losing the contract. Again, Ontario with FIPA, immutable backups or you lose your license. The QC Law 25, think about it, that's more like GDPR style fines plus very strict consent for that. And for the BC, must never leave Canada. All right. So when it comes to 365, there is a little bit of a gap there. Again, that shared responsibility model I was talking about, remember that services section 6B? What are they responsible for? They are responsible for data centers and network. Now, the basic retention, when I said 30 days, is when someone deletes it and goes into a recycle bin. That's when it starts to count. But your role, let's say Microsoft's role is that, but you as a service provider and your client is to protect against that accidental deletion, ransomware, insider threats, and so forth, right? That's where they say we highly strive that you use a third-party product. From a disaster recovery perspective, you got to meet certain RTOs and RPOs for Canadian regulations. 365 does not guarantee it, okay? And you got to have the audit trails. I'm going to go a little bit into DR here. It's not going to be long for that. But ultimately, when it comes to disaster recovery, you can't ignore the DR requirements. You can see that, under PUPIDA, it's you got to restore the data without unreasonable delay. That's how it's written after a breach. All right, for B13, you have to test these annually, and you got to document your recovery steps. The provincial laws, all right, we're talking about, in BC or Quebec, right? It's data residency rules, right? That backups must stay there. For 365, no built-in geo failover for user data if a Canadian data center fails, okay? And again, is there point-in-time recovery for emails, SharePoint, Teams, all that stuff beyond, well, I'm going to say 30 days, not 14, right? And when you're talking about disaster recovery, right, you want to frame the compliance as a revenue protector, not just a cost, right? And this is positioning the solution as an essential layer where 365 lacks for it, okay? Any questions on that at this point? So I'm going to stop my share and go to the other quicker DR item. You get to see. Oh, no, you didn't get to see that. All right, cool. Disaster recovery. Here we go. Is there any questions so far? I'm trying to share. Oh, here we go. Share this. All right. This won't be as long, but it's very important for us to talk about. I'm not going to go through that. When it comes to disaster recovery, a lot of people, listen, there's natural disasters, but it's a short amount. A lot of it is human issues. Yes, people get hit with cyber attacks, but really a lot of it comes from data deletion, whether it's accidental or malicious, and then hardware failures and software corruption. That is a big area when it comes to this. So what are the types of disasters out there, right? So you could see, again, a lot of it is not just some cyber attack. Where the fit's going to come into this are people that are, like we just talked about with the regulated compliancy requirements, but also in stringent supply chains. And then very mission critical stuff. I can tell you law firms are a big one for this because they lack the technical resources and they have a heavy reliance on IT for their business functions, and they don't have that DR experience. So law firms is big. Finance, healthcare, especially with all the compliance requirements, for that. I would also put like telco in here as well, that you see here. Again, disaster recovery is about short-term recovery. Think about critical stuff like your servers, databases, right? Certain applications. You got to fail over to a backup site, right? It's really wanting to get these things back up real quick, okay? I talked about RTOs and RPOs. Recovery point objective. How far back in time is an acceptable loss, okay? And that's something you really have to sit down with the people that make decisions at your end users. And it could be different for different systems, right? Like I said, the critical server for web commerce versus that front desk reception person, right? You're gonna have two different recovery point objectives, okay? And really discuss these things. Recovery time objective is how much time is acceptable to be down, right? The Amazon Web Services, right? I don't think there was any control over that, but did you meet that service level agreement with them? Because if they say we want to have a recovery time objective of an hour, well, it's going to cost a lot of money, right, to do so. Yeah, we're okay with the day if we're down. We can accept that as far as an acceptable loss. Okay. Again, payroll, accounting, especially at the end of the month, payroll. That's going to have a shorter RTO. One of the key things I want to bring up is backup is not disaster recovery. Okay. Um, all backup really is just protecting data against the loss, right? But disaster recovery is more about critical applications, rapid recovery. Okay. Most of the time, it's definitely for servers, right? You got to get things back up and quickly for it, right? It's warm, hot storage for that. Again, things go down, you fail over. In our case, it's going to spin up into the Acronis data center. You can do Azure as well. It's natively integrated with that. And then when everything's back, you bring it back up. The thing about DRAS is you will see, is it in here? Runbooks, I guess they call it orchestration. With backup, all right, even with that instant restore, that's one thing. But with orchestration, with runbooks, sometimes when it comes to disaster recovery, you're going to have manual operations. And I can tell you from personal experience, test these things. You'd be pleasantly surprised at when the stuff hits the fan, all right, how emotions get involved and how people can change based on stressful situations. They might, I'm going to say hypothetically, take their keyboard and throw it up against the wall and it bashed into a whole bunch of pieces. Um, you got to have things documented. But for example, manual steps, right? I got to notify the company. Are we good with going into a DR mode? Yes. I may have to change MX records. That might take a little while. I got to wait for that. We got to work with the public relations team of how we're going to get information out there. Or now we have to report this to the regulatory agencies. How are we going to do it? What information is there? Maybe the lawyers got to get involved to make sure you're doing it right. Those are all manual things, right? Forget start stop servers in different orders, like a database and a web commerce server, right? Which could be in different zones, right? One's got to start up before the other, right? So those are the things that we talk about there. Yeah, okay. There are three types. Cloud only, and just to let you know, you can have for free a cloud only VPN. It really helps you test your backups. And you get what they call 32 compute points per month. So there's 8 different levels of servers, F1 through F8. You get 32 compute points per month per tenant to do this with for free. It's a good way to validate a backup like, hey, can this actually go in there, right? So if you had an F4, you're going to get 8 hours, right? F1, you're going to get 16 hours, right? You're going to, and F8, you're going to get like 2 hours. So it depends on the size of the box. But you can have a cloud only, doesn't require any kind of VPN. Where it says site to site Open VPN, you need to have the Open VPN appliance installed. You can then switch it to point to site once it's been a site to site. That's at layer 2. When you get into layer 3, where you now have to have IPsec type VPN, where the encryption is both the header and the tunnel and all that kind of stuff. When you have certificates, when you have very, very high, tight security standards, that's where multi-site comes into play. There's 2 types of servers for disaster recovery, right? There's the recovery server, right? You got to have at least a protection plan with a backup, right, for it. All right. Cloud storage must be selected as one of them. You should run it at least once to make sure it's successfully created. And then you have primary servers, which are connected to the cloud, and they have to be set up already to switch over. Okay. Again, I said you can do this disaster recovery of Azure virtual machines you have right to our Acronis Cyber Protect cloud for a failover. So if you're using Azure, you're good to go. We can fail over to a malware-free recovery point as well. Okay, in the product. Immutable recovery points, right? You could do that as well. You can have immutable storage, right? Initiate the failover to our Acronis cloud from a deleted recovery point. You can do automated fail back as well. And I know we're getting closer on the end of the time here. You can do some fast failback of the original virtual machine. So you can have it where if it's agent based, you have to do it via bootable media, and that only, that allows you to do a failback to an original virtual or physical machine. Only the changes that have happened will be transferred, right? In that situation, or you can just do a new machine. There is the availability that if you install the agent on, the hypervisor, you can do a failback to a new virtual machine as well. You can do automated test failovers, right? So this allows you to check to make sure over a period of time that, hey, I'm going to schedule this once a month uh, to do an automated test failover to make sure that things work. But you see in that server configuration there, that one virtual core 4 gig of RAM there on the right, that's an F1, right? So there's 8 different types of boxes. I wanted to make that to the point as far as the compute points. Again, runbooks, we talked about that a little bit. It allows you to, and you can have nested runbooks, like a runbook inside a runbook. When you go through tabletop exercises or simulated fire drills or live fire drill exercise, whatever the case may be, once you have that all documented, just make sure the runbooks actually follow that. Sometimes you need to have some hybrid disaster recovery. Again, stringent data localization requirements. This fits with y'all. Okay. Clients' requirements, faster SLAs, right? I'm not going to get into that. So it's funny. I sometimes ask people in disaster recovery, so what is your current DR strategy? And they may say, well, we do backups. Okay. Well, if you have downtime, how much? I'll tell you this number 2 up here. How much does 1 hour of downtime cost you? I say to them, I said, how do you define downtime at your company? You'll get a whole bunch of different answers. Some will have employee payroll in there, revenue per employee as numbers. Some will just say, well, our average sales on a web commerce server are $5,000 an hour. So that's what our downtime cost is. Well, they're not taking the full cost at that point, right? So you kind of see where their head is. How much downtime is acceptable? I'm going to leave you with these, but how do you position based on the buzzwords and the wording? Depends on how you position it to either like a business person or a technical person. If I'm talking to a technical person, I'm going to talk about SLA 321 compliance, right? For the executives, I'm going to talk about employee productivity, insurance, and compliance, for example. When you're talking to a financial person, these are really cool things to say. Well, I know you only do backups, but from a disaster recovery standpoint, we're going to reduce downtime of operations. This can be actually an OPEX, an operating expenditure versus a capital expenditure. We're really helping to protect your company assets with it, really reduce your liability, obligations, especially with you being in a compliant of, XYZ, negative exposure, reputational loss, and really to protect your financial losses. Okay. How do you define downtime, Mr. Finance person? Now, if I'm talking to an IT person, I'm going to say, we want to make sure you have a well orchestrated recovery as far as getting things back up. Your job is also to help protect company assets, also with the compliance, and to make sure that you have negative exposure minimized for your executives. And you're going to be responsible for crisis management. Right? You see where I'm going with the different wording? And IT people should have an agreement with the executives about how much is there. And it's about a CYA. A lot of times the IT people are like, I don't want to deal with this, right? And that's where you come in. If it's too expensive, okay, with our product, the only extra fee you're going to have, so if you have backup and you have a primary server, that backup over there, that's a storage cost. So there is going to be more cost to it on a monthly basis. When they need it, and say they only need it for 12 hours, that's where all that compute point stuff comes into play. And then when they don't need it, it shuts off, but you're only then paying for the backup. Again, one downtime event pays for this. How do you do? Is it too expensive for your time reputation? All right. Again, this works with the existing backup strategy. No additional hardware is required for DR. We already have offsite backups. Okay, let's talk about bringing things back. Let's talk about the regulations of DR that we talked about. What are we paying for every month? Well, you know what? You pay for insurance anyway. Even on the executives, you have errors and omissions insurance, right? In case they mess up. It's very similar to an insurance policy, right? You're paying for that backup, but you're hoping to never use it. But boy, when you need it, you're glad you have the insurance. Again, we're not in a disaster. I live in Arizona. We're not a disaster prone area. Well, I can tell you that ransomware doesn't check the Arizona zip codes first. Okay. I've seen a lot of hardware and software failures and people doing stupid things. And that is it. So any questions? I really tried to give about, at least 5 more minutes. I know it was a lot to take in. That's why it's recorded. Also, you're going to have copies of these. You have those, right? If I remember. Celine?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. Anything you want to add to this, Celine? Because I don't see any questions.
No, that was great. I mean, it was very clear to me. So I did check. I asked in the chat as well if there were any questions, but nothing. So I think it was pretty clear.
Yeah, I would focus a little bit definitely on the compliancy stuff because they might be aware of it. But I could tell you that once they're told about it, they might have been an ostrich in the sand, right? An ostrich, putting their head in the sand. But the minute you start telling them that, and then some legal thing happens later, next thing you know, you might be getting some interesting call to say, did you guys ever have a discussion with this? Because the phone calls were recorded and they were audited and they started listening to the phone calls and they realized they talked to you as a service provider and they realized that you did mention it to them and they decided not to do it. And then next thing you know, with the lawsuit, they're like, well, you had service providers tell you this. How come you didn't do it? Right. So anyway, so thanks for the explanation. Okay. Again, I wanted to give you those things with the backup and the DR there. So when you're talking about the compliances specifically for Canada, you got it. And Jean-Pierre, appreciate the comment.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for attending. I know it was a lot, but when you get these presentations, hopefully you could take stuff off it and do it in your personality. My personality is going to be different than yours from a sales perspective. Just do it in your personality. And then just take the concepts and just start with something. So again, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Steven. Thanks everybody for joining.
Have a good day, everybody.
Have a good day.